Dr. Michael Ard.
Peter, thank you, and welcome everyone to our program. These are interesting and difficult times in Latin America. The region is turning broadly to populist left-wing governments as it struggles to recover from COVID and economic stagnation. It appears to be turning away from close ties with the United States, or that's the concern in some circles. Meanwhile, Washington policymakers are distracted with other concerns. With us today to discuss issues in Latin America and the use of intelligence by policymakers is Kimberly Breier. Let me say a little bit about her background. Kimberly Breier has more than 20 years of experience in foreign policy, primarily focused on Western Hemisphere affairs. Ms. Breier is a non-lawyer, was Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. She also served as the Western Hemisphere member of the policy planning staff at State. She was previously founder and director of the U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative and deputy director of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C. She also was vice president of a consulting firm leading country risk assessment teams for private clients in Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. In addition to her private sector and think tank experience, Ms. Breier served for more than a decade in the U.S. intelligence community as a political analyst and manager focused on Latin America. And she also served on the National Security Council's Office of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Welcome, Kimberly Breier.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here with you, and thanks for the invitation to Johns Hopkins for hosting this today. Nothing I enjoy more than talking about Latin America, and in particular, kind of the fusion of intelligence and policy. First, to Michael's point, those of us who have spent our lives working on Latin America and the Caribbean, always lament sort of a lack of attention from the senior levels of policy in the US toward the region. And I will confess, as some who know me know, that was not necessarily my problem in my last job. We actually had a unique moment where you had a lot of things going on in the region that were capturing policymaker attention. But I do agree that in general, there's a tendency for events around the world to monopolize the US agenda. In this regard, I have been absolutely a broken record on the idea that there is no region of the world that touches the lives of Americans every day, all day, as much as Latin America and the Caribbean. I've done a number of talks on Mexico where I've talked about the details on that relationship. But anything you could say about Mexico, from trade to people ties to shared values, support for democracy and markets, immigration, transnational crime, also applies all across the region. So I am a tireless advocate for the importance of this region, and have been very pleased to have spent my career working on it. And my bottom line for any students who may be listening is, please do consider a future in foreign policy focused on this region. If you're from the region, please also focus on the US. These relationships are really important. It's very rewarding, and I can assure you that it is also never dull. So there's always a lot going on. Wanted to just say a few words today about sort of the policy and intel worlds and how they intersect in the context of Latin America policy. As Michael kindly mentioned, I've kind of been on both sides of it. I've been on the intel side and I've been on the policy side. And I can say, a couple of things with pretty high confidence. As we say in the intelligence community, we often do our assessments with noting our level of confidence. I can say with high confidence that starting out your career as an intel analyst gives you a real leg up once you get thrown in the deep end on the policy side. It would have taken me so much longer to get up to speed and to be effective in my policy roles if I had not sort of grown up as an analyst. So I think that's really important. There are a number of really transferable skills. As a policy person, you need to be able to assess large volumes of information. You have information coming from all sides, including in many cases, the foreign government itself. You need to be able to assess sources, filter out biases. You need to be able to assess what policy options are realistic. And most importantly, kind of to always have your eye on two things, which were drilled into me as an analyst. And one is know what your own biases are. And two, be very aware of what you do not know. And that is to say, you know, having been trained to look at your own biases and also to actively think about what is it that I don't know. This requires imagination. What if X or Y were true? What happens then? These are really important skills that I think should be taught in any sort of, so you want to be a policymaker 101 sort of course. And only half jokingly, it is also really helpful to have been trained to focus on where your information came from, where you heard it, where you read it, and to remember that when your staff walks into the room and tells you that you're speaking to the New York Times in 20 minutes about Venezuela. So these are just fundamental analytic skills that I think serve me very well in the policy environment. So to cut to the chase on sort of the topic about sort of intelligence and strategic intelligence in particular, and not just the training, you know, being helpful in the policy job, of course, you know, the answer is yes, you know, it plays an important role. But I think, you know, I think my view is that it plays a role in a way that you might not think in your first instance in thinking about the question. The daily updates you get of raw information, of course, are useful, but I found myself more often than not on the policy side, not wanting to know so much what was being said, but the so what and what the analysts thought about it. Even more so than the secrets, it's the thinking, you know, it's the strategic sort of critical thinking that was really important. Everyone thinks of classified information when they think of intelligence. And of course there's that, and it can often be useful, but I think, you know, what we don't focus on enough is the expertise and the critical thinking that needs to be involved. We often talk about the what, the so what, and the implications for US policy as intel people. For me, it was the so what and the implications. And even further than that, trying to figure out on the policy side, what can I do about it, if anything? This was really true for me on issues I was less familiar with, but it was also true across the board. I've looked at Mexico as long as anybody, but sometimes I would just call up a really smart analyst I knew who had been doing it for a long time and check myself and check my thinking and talk things through. And what do you think about this? And you know, this is intelligence for strategy. I needed smart people to think. And I want to just list a couple of major inflection points, I would say, things that I confronted during my time where this sort of critical thinking element was really important. I'll mention one from my time as an analyst because I drew some, I think, pretty important lessons from it, and then a couple from the more recent experience on the policy side at the State Department. One on the intel side in the early 2000s, sort of one case jumps out at me, and I was working on Argentina at the time in the run-up to the decision that the government eventually took ultimately to default on its foreign debt. And I was the political analyst at the time, very junior analyst. And to be honest, I ended up getting fairly crosswise with the policy people in Washington because I came to the view as the political analyst that the decision that the Argentine government was likely to make was more of a political one than an economic one. And you all know the history. Argentina did default at the time and on its sovereign debt, and then later to the IMF. The most senior ranks of the US government were somewhat caught off guard at that time. They didn't think it was going to happen. And for me, it was sort of a classic case of not spending enough time focusing on what you don't know, and also mirror imaging onto another country your own way of seeing the world. I took some powerful lessons from that, and one of them was there's little point in being right if the people who are supposed to listen to you don't listen. So clearly, you know, I needed to do a better job conveying and why I had the point of view I had, how it was based, and making a more compelling argument. And in my later roles, you know, when I jumped the fence from sort of intel to policy, I made the point of listening to people I disagreed with for precisely this reason, to understand the underlying argumentation and to understand why we all may be reading the same information and reaching totally different conclusions. And that's what happened in the case of Argentina. We'd all had the same information, but I reached a different conclusion. And why was that? And that it's not that the tactical intelligence was wrong or incomplete, or it was a case where the analysts and the policymakers simply came to different conclusions on the strategic question at hand. So if you fast forward from that experience, 20 years ago, on the intel side, I end up in the State Department at an interesting time, at a time of accelerating change in the world, where lots of things are going on at the same time, as they are now. And one of them was, I was in the government when Mexican President López Obrador was elected. And he had, campaigned against NAFTA. We were in the middle of renegotiating the trade deal at the time, what became the USMCA. He had written a book about President Trump. And so, everyone sort of believed that there was this inevitable clash coming. And that, on the surface, it certainly, appeared that the two governments were heading in very different directions. There was certainly a lot of noise day to day, a lot of what's, I would call it, all over the place. This is happening and that's happening. But if you go, even further into it, you understand the context and the drivers, and you start to really dig in and do the analytic thinking, you begin to realize that there is a possible route, that there are commonalities, that yes, there are political differences on the surface, but then you go underneath it to the policy and sort of get to the heart of the matter, and you can do things. You get a trade deal done, you build out a bilateral agenda, you even have a visit at the White House, and then you make significant progress on immigration. A lot of things became possible when you took the strategic framework and figured out how to operate within it. Everyone thought that a clash at that time was inevitable, but it was not, and it required a lot of strategic thinking by a lot of people on both sides to ensure that we found a way to work forward in a way that's beneficial to both the American people and the Mexican people. Another major crossroads that we faced during my time, pretty much simultaneously with what was going on with Mexico, was Venezuela in January of 2019, where Venezuelan actors interpreted their constitution to read that in the absence of leadership, after Maduro had blatantly stolen the 2018 elections, the head of the National Assembly becomes the interim president of Venezuela. This is where Juan Guaido entered the scene. We needed to know a lot of what's at the time. What did the Venezuelan constitution say? Who was Juan Guaido? What was going on in the opposition parties? Would they support him? But we also needed an awful lot of so what's and implications. What would recognizing Juan Guaido mean for Venezuela, for Guaido himself, for the opposition, for US policy, for Venezuelan assets, for the Federal Reserve, for Venezuelan embassies and diplomats, for the OAS, for the IDB, for the United Nations? Who would be with us? Who would not be with us? What would it mean, if we recognize Juan Guaido? And also, what would it mean if we didn't? And these were the huge strategic questions at the time, where what we needed was strategic thinking. Based on our understanding of what was going on, the understanding of the history of the country, the understanding of where the region was, where our allies were. Much of this is not secrets. It's just hardcore analytic thinking. And again, no one person can process all of this, even if it often feels like you're sort of, you had to. You needed a lot of smart people reading and pulling things together and doing a lot of thinking. The policy outcome there is now, it's in the history books, and it continues today. The United States recognizes Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. Decision of policy, a decision of strategy. We can all critique it today and say you should have done this, or you should have done that, and that's fine, and we should do, but within the context of the policy decision that was faced at the time. So these three, I've just given sort of an Argentina, Mexico, and Venezuela. There are many more. These are examples of major inflection points, in my view, in the history of US relations with key countries in Latin America. But more than anything, these are stories in strategic thinking and needing to understand scenarios. And I think, all of these things have something in common, which is, as a policymaker and as the analysts who support the policymaker, what's needed is imagination. We need people to think through the possible outcomes and scenarios, to take what they know and apply it. it isn't a matter of just saying this is going on today, sort of the CNN of intelligence. It really needs to be, much more than that. And that is what I found so useful from our colleagues in the intelligence community during my time on the policy side. And the key lesson, again, having been on the intelligence side, I've written presidential daily briefs myself. I've read some now on the other side. And strategic intelligence to me is really about using this information to inform strategy, but it also entails just letting smart people think. It requires this imagination. And so for this reason, I'm a really big supporter of analytic techniques and the exercises that sort of bring smart people together to think through and sort of get out of their day-to-day sort of lane of what's happening. For me, this is a really important function of the intelligence community, and I'm very happy to hear about cases that I occasionally hear about now where those kinds of things are still going on and people are using their imaginations to think through some of the big questions that face us. There are a lot of them now, as Michael pointed out. It's, I think, a really challenging time in the region. All the more reason why this sort of imaginative strategic thinking needs to go on. So with that, I will stop and happy to take some questions. And thanks again, Michael.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim, for that. And I think we all appreciate hearing your perspective on it and what you were able to do in your time in government. We thank you for that. A lot of things that you said really intrigued me. One was your experience on Argentina as an analyst, and you had a sense for the political pulse there that a lot of the policymakers clearly did not. And is that a fair characterization? And I mean, a lot of times this just comes from time in the region and understanding the people and the players and what their motivations are, which is often very hard for us to get when we're back in the United States and really not in touch with that on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, mirror imaging, right? Is, because no one wants to default, we think.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And what I used to do every day it had nothing to do with secrets. I used to read the newspaper. I would read multiple Argentine newspapers every day to know what the columnists were saying, with a paper that leaned in one direction was saying this, and the paper that leaned in another direction was saying that. And when the two of them started agreeing, you knew that you had a situation. And so I think some of it was language and ability to just read. I spent a lot of time there also. And I think also, it's just recognizing sort of the multidisciplinary part of this, which is a lot of people were seeing the issue of would they or would they not default as an economic question, and failing to recognize that for Argentina, it was really fundamentally a political question, even more so. In that case, I would argue you have to ask the Argentine government at the time why they did it. But for me, it seems that they made a decision that was more political in nature than economic. I think it's the multidisciplinary teams that were important in that as well, just bringing a different perspective to a question that many people in Washington were thinking of strictly as an economic question.
And your point too about you're a junior analyst, you've got this idea, this idea is running into headwinds. How much does your management support back you up in that, and how much are they helping you sort of pave the way to get that message across?
They were, and I will give them full credit. They backed me up. They let me write what I wanted to write, and we did. We wrote it as high as the president's daily brief a number of times, and I can tell you it created quite a bit of tension on the policy side in DC, because you had Intel saying one thing and the policy people telling the president quite another. So you end up in really in the crosshairs, and as in Intel, you're not the policymaker, but you're just trying to inform their decision making. And for me, it was a very hard lesson that sort of getting the call right was important, of course, but at the end of the day, I didn't do a good enough job convincing people that they really needed to look at this question in a different way. And so for me, the lesson for that applied in my policy job, which was you've got to listen to people that you don't agree with all the time. because sometimes they're right. So,
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. And as analysts, of course, we do too. We can easily get, into the same, we can get into, and it's easy for us to start to say, how's this is this message, how much trimming should I do, or should I, to get this message more palatable, sell it somehow. That's a big risk to that. Another thing I was wanted to ask about, and I like you, found the rise of Lopez Obrador to be fascinating. He'd been on the scene for so long. I saw that, I think, along with a lot of people, as being a real break. Mexico, from having for years been linked up with sort of the neoliberalist reformist agenda, and now somebody's president who doesn't agree with that at all. And what would that mean for NAFTA? What would it mean for U.S. relations? Everything. And I think that where do you think when they're looking to people who felt that they had a better feel for that, where do you think they got that from? Because it was interesting the way it turned out. I mean, there was a lot more cooperation, between Lopez Obrador's government and the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. I mean, the first thing was obviously, we knew we needed to start sort of, engage early and often, so there were a lot of conversations, I think, mostly aimed at just sharing information, trying, married as a perfect example, the security program between the countries that I think it's fair to say the Mexican administration that was coming in was skeptical of at best. And it's still, it remains in place today under a new framework. But I think, most of it was just, sharing information, opening up everything and saying, look, here's what it is. Here's our relationship. Here's what we're doing together. Here's why we think, we should keep doing this together. It's, your choice. But we're giving you the full information on what's going on, and trying to be sort of open and show, why we thought that what we were doing together was important for both countries. And so, it was a lot of engagement and trying to sort of really understand, what the incoming governments at that time in 2018, what their, what their real interests were with us, what they wanted to accomplish. And it became clear very quickly. And I think I give a lot of credit to the Lopez Obrador government for finalizing the trade deal, which became USMCA. It wasn't done yet when President Lopez Obrador got elected in July of 2018. We were in the middle of the negotiation, and he sent a negotiator to join the talks. And then together you had this situation that probably no one could have predicted, without imagination, especially, of the Peña Nieto government signing a trade deal that the incoming Lopez Obrador administration supported. And, and Lopez Obrador had campaigned against NAFTA for decades. Yeah. So really, I mean, I think it was, sort of getting to the heart of what we as governments wanted to accomplish, listening, and also sharing a lot of information. And so, and trying to figure out, not paying so much attention to all of the sort of political noise, but trying to figure out where are the commonalities, where is the common ground, and how do we do this, for the benefit of the people in both countries.
You made a point that where strategic intelligence isn't always intelligence, and maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's one of my favorite sort of takeaways from all of this, is that, people who have worked on Latin America know this is not an area where there's a lot of quote unquote intelligence. A lot of it is just sort of understanding the history of the region, the culture, the way the culture and the people think about things. A lot of it is that sort of thing. It's really much more of an exercise in strategic thinking, and it is in, finding out the secret, information about whatever the issue of the day is. And so, for me, and that's something that if I were to be critical of the intelligence community, which I sometimes am, I think these days there's sort of too much emphasis on the day-to-day sort of, what's the latest secret or the latest thing that we found out and we report it, rather than sort of the really thoughtful, strategic papers that take the long view on a particular topic or country and really sort of delve into the broad trend lines. It's a little bit of forest in the trees. kind of problem. We often get stuck in the trees because there's so many, and every day there's a new tree kind of thing, especially with social media. There's always some new thing going on, and we tend to chase it around. But you can lose sight of the bigger picture, if you're doing that. And I think in the Mexico case, what we really needed was that big picture. We're two countries that live next door to each other. We are inextricably intertwined in so many ways. We have shared interests. How do we do this? And so that was really, it was really a set of strategic questions. It wasn't about, collecting intel. That wasn't the purpose. That wasn't what we needed. It was about, sort of how do we think about this in a strategic way.
Right. I mean, a lot of times, if you're looking for an answer from human or whatever on this, you're not going to get it oftentimes. And there wasn't even, and frankly, a lot of times during this era, and when I was doing it too, there weren't the resources on it like there were. We were considered kind of, that was global coverage stuff. It was not really, there wasn't really a lot of attention being paid to these questions. So you had to make do. Actually, and maybe it forced us to look at other better sources in some ways to try to answer these questions. Something also that you said that I think our listeners would enjoy hearing about. And by the way, everybody, do ask questions. We will get to all of them. And thank you for what you've been providing so far. But of course, your interest in structured analytic techniques. You, in fact, were a manager on that. You are an advocate and an evangelist of structured analytic techniques. How have you used them, and maybe even continue to use them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So use them all the time. I would say even in the private sector, because they involve something I mentioned early on, which is essentially questioning yourself. Questioning your own biases, questioning your own thinking, and having what I think sometimes can take some courage, but the courage to say, what if I am totally wrong about this? What does that mean? And a lot of those analytic techniques, as you know better than anyone, Michael, are about, devil's advocacy is one, arguing the opposite case, but there's many other techniques where you can do scenarios, kind of spinning out sort of the way the future might look, depending on certain variables. There are key assumptions checks, making sure that what you assume to be true, and that that you were assuming that to be true as part of your analysis. I think those can be very useful. Those are a little more tactical, but I think those can be very useful. There's a whole range of sort of tools that you can apply. And, I think people get put off when they think that, oh, I have to, or even in the private sector, I've got to spend all this money doing this big scenarios exercise to game out all this thing. Not necessarily, right. You can get a small group of people together to just sort of, with the express goal of having a conversation about what if we're wrong, what are our key assumptions. You can do it in a much more, informal way. And I think it's just something to sort of practice, every day, in life, whether you're in the private sector, whether you're in government. And what I used to do a lot, I was blessed with having just tremendously smart analysts working on some of these topics. And a lot of times I would just call them up and, have a conversation, say, what's going on? What if, are we doing this wrong? What happens if this? What do you guys think of that? And, just having sort of that conversation to sort of stress test what you were trying to do. So I continue to be an advocate for it. I think we shouldn't overdo it and make them these big formal exercises all the time. Those have value as well, but I think you can also do it in a way that you sort of integrate into your daily life, like getting your extra steps. Do a little analytic exercise with yourself, and with a few key people that on a sort of a regular basis. So I would say I'm pretty regular practitioner on that.
Great. Let me get to some of the questions in the chat now from Barbara. When policymakers ask, what should we do about it? How does an analyst get around to the old rule of not being policy prescriptive? What's the proper balance here?
That's a great question. Thanks, Barbara. And that is a really tough one. I think in this modern sort of fast-paced world as well. The old standby is to say, if you're the analyst, to respond and basically say, well, the US were to do this, the country would react in this way, or the following things would happen. So you spin out the implications of, of a policy action, the implications that are the non-US, implications. And I think that's sort of the, the quickest way to go about it. I tend to agree that being prescriptive as an analyst is not, I think it's a good rule. I think it's there for a reason. I don't think that analysts should be advocating, especially as we as a country are so polarized now politically. I just don't think it's a good idea for the IC to be attaching itself to particular policies. But I think it should, should not hesitate to spin out, here's what happens. If you do this, this is what happens. If you do this, this is what happens. If you do nothing, this is what happens. So sometimes doing nothing is the right answer. And that's really hard for policymakers as well, because they always feel compelled to action, but sometimes you shouldn't act. So I think, spinning out those things is sort of the way to get around it. And I think it's the right thing to do. I really think the analyst thrives on their objectivity. And that your reputation and your ability to be objective is
Right.
the ballgame. So
there's imagination, the ability to offer options, or there's possibilities. I mean, that's I think that's the way around it. And thanks for joining us, Juan from Guatemala. Thank you. Jordan asks, if multiple intelligence analysts come to the similar conclusion on a question, but it differs from the policymakers, can it be hard to change a policymaker's mind?
Short answer, yes. I certainly lived that on my Argentina example. I can think of some more current examples. Yeah, it's very hard. But the other thing you have to understand is the policymaker has on many levels a much broader scope. So when the intel analyst is writing about what's going on in country X or Y, the policymaker is sitting in Washington, figuring out what's going on Capitol Hill. What are the other forces at play? Where is the administration? What are the politics of this? I mean, there are a lot more factors that don't really, on the US side, that don't factor into the analysis. So sometimes you can have situations where the intelligence analysis may point in a particular direction, but the overall framework in DC is really not conducive to a policy change, and it would be very difficult to do that. I don't think those are ideal circumstances at all. Those are very difficult circumstances, and they're ones that you would hope would not exist. But I think they do exist. I also think that we all need to be humble and realize that if you're a group of analysts who are convinced that you're right, maybe you're right, but you also may be wrong. And so may the policymaker, right? So I think everyone just needs to have a little bit of humility. And if you're on the analytics side and you're having a hard time, getting the policy people to listen to you, I think you've really got to approach them in a way where you're trying to help them. You're not trying to prove that you're right? You're trying to help the policy. And I think that's the other piece of it. Sometimes as analysts, and I'm sure I've done this myself, I've gotten wed to the idea that I'm right, and that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to make sure that the United States has the best possible policy. So if you approach the policy people in that way, and I think at least get them to listen, right. Get them to listen to what you have to say. It's important, and I would say keep at it, because I think it's important for policy people to listen to that.
It's funny because when you say, like, when you get to a certain point where you think, I know I'm right on this, it's usually the product of a lot of battles internally where you've been trying to bring people along to a position, and sometimes it's an exhausting process, and it seems hard to sort of walk back from that once you feel like you've achieved something and you've come to a closure. Then it's hard to give it up. Follow up to that, Jordan asks, how do you know when you know enough or have enough information on a topic or question to make a conclusion? Always an interesting issue.
Well, I mean, I would say this. So I think the answer to that question might be different on the intel side as is on the policy side. You don't always have the luxury of time. Right. And so you have to make the decision when you have to make the decision, based on the circumstances. And, if the intel analysts feel they don't have enough information, they can't get back to you for 3 weeks, well, okay, but I have to decide this on Tuesday, so there's, so I think that is important to understand that, the policy process and pressures may be such that you end up having to make important decisions without all of the information that you would like to have. I think that's probably the case 99% of the time. And so on the analytics side, I think you have to lean forward and understand the policy process, understand where it is, and understand how much time you have, to come to conclusions, because wonderfully right analysis a month late didn't accomplish anything. And so it's got to be on time. And that requires understanding where the policy person is. On the policy side, it's very difficult. It's a high risk operation, depending on what issues you're working on, having to make decisions in an imperfect world with imperfect information. But that's the job, and it's
That's right.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Often you get a chance to write about it again and update your story, and with objectivity and being said, we know more now than we did when we wrote about this the first time.
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. Thanks to everybody for these great questions. We continue to have a bunch of them in. Let me ask a few more. Thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for sharing. I am curious about whether you believe China is taking all of its, and what is China doing with its investments in Latin America's infrastructure? Are its loans strategic, even predatory at times? What's your view?
That's a great question. So I'm on the record on that. My first major speech as Assistant Secretary of State was about China in Latin America. And in fact, it was the first speech by any Assistant Secretary in the Trump administration about China working in regional context. So I'm on the record with a pretty tough line on that. And, I think, look, in a perfect world, we would be back. I was also in the Bush administration. We would be back at a time where we thought that we could manage our interests as major, important economic powers and global powers, and that some, Chinese involvement in the region was not only inevitable, but also, could have a positive impact. Look, I think the ground has shifted, and I think every country in the region will make its own decisions about its investments. From my perspective, I think it's really important to have processes like we have in the United States, the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment, which screens investment coming into the United States on national security terms. I think that's a really important thing to do. I think whether you have a formal mechanism or an informal mechanism, I think countries all across the region should be doing that actively. And should be thinking about the strategic implications of certain investments in the region. And, I think at the end of the day, countries in the region also, all of them work with China pretty much one way or the other, with a couple of exceptions. And I think, they just need to be, have their eyes open and be careful, as anyone would, with the implications of certain kinds of investments. I mean, I think a lot of the cases that are out there and, very public speak for themselves. The dams in Ecuador, there are many cases of investments where they've not turned out the way the government that promoted the investment wanted them to turn out. So I think it's just a sort of a kind of eyes wide open situation. And again, I don't think the United States can tell countries in the region what to do on this, but I think countries would be wise to have their own screening mechanisms to make sure that they've thought through and imagined all of the future implications of what it is that they're doing.
All right, thanks. Another question. Lopez Obrador was willing to cooperate with the U.S., but what about these other Latin American governments that are coming in from the populist left? What do you see that playing out for us?
That's a great question. I think it's a real challenge. I would point out as well, during my time, we also built a pretty strong relationship with Brazil during that time, a government there of a very different, ideological stripe. And I guess, my overarching perspective is, these are free and fair elections in the countries that they're talking about. These leaders have been chosen by the people. And we as Americans don't get to pick. We work with who the people elect, and I think it's our job and it's our responsibility to find ways to find common ground, to find ways to cooperate. It's going to be easier or harder depending on the circumstance. I think the jury's out on some of these things, but I think we have to try to find ways. I think this region is too important. And I don't think we can be ideological about it. I think we have to go in and just say, okay, here's our situation. I think these relationships also are really important for countries in the region. So if the countries in the region, decide that they would rather not have a close relationship with Washington, I think there's going to be a real cost for them in that as well. And so I think you've really got to have, again, an open mind, a little bit of humility, and respect the decision of the voters in these countries and work with the leaders they choose.
Thanks. Marcel asked about a question related to the geospatial intelligence world. Marcel, would you mind following that up? Can you offer a little more example on what you're looking for there so we can phrase that? Thanks. And Juan asks, have there been instances of competitors or Latin American governments using misinformation to exploit policymakers' ideological biases, overriding, therefore, sound intelligence and analysis? So examples of maybe active misinformation, or could we say disinformation, coming out from that?
That is a really, really hard question to answer. I think the answer is probably yes, but can I think of any in this region off the top of my head where I can think? I think that's really tough. I mean, that's really tough to answer in this environment. But I think it's a risk, and I think if you're in the intel world, you have always got to be mindful, and that's what I was mentioning about sort of, especially when you get into policy roles where you have relationships, with governments around the region. You've always got to be checking and thinking to yourself, and as you're an analyst, your first training course, teaches you to know where your information is coming from and know if there's a bias in it. And the phrase is, intends to influence as well as inform. So,
Right.
So I think, you need to be really mindful of that. I think it's true in the intel world and it's true in the policy world. So, I mean, I think you just got to be thoughtful. And again, it's an analytic exercise in checking, your own bias and your own way of thinking.
Right. Another question here from Jim. Considering the uptick in external state activity in the region, where would you assess U.S. policymakers are in the process of counteracting efforts by actors such as Russia, China, and Iran? How does the U.S. move toward maintaining its allies in the region in the short term or long term?
That's a great question. And I think that's the kind of the strategic question of the day. Look, I mean, my assessment is so far, obviously I'm not in the government, I'm not involved in the process. So I'm looking as the armchair observer from outside. But I think, I think there's got to be a lot of strategic thinking about this, and the US has really got to step up its game. And I think we started that to some extent in the Trump administration, using the Development Finance Corporation and really, trying to shore up particularly the economic relationships in the region. I think that's one thing that we should be doing more of, and I certainly would be an advocate for sort of more aggressive engagement with the economic tools like the Exim Bank and the Development Finance Corporation. I am also still very much an advocate for the trade agenda. I think we have got to have a trade agenda, and right now, as those of you who follow this may know, what's called the Fast Track Authority in Congress to negotiate trade agreements has lapsed. And so you're not seeing the United States move toward additional trade agreements. We have many trade agreements already in the region, but you're not seeing a move to create more bilateral or sub-regional agreements. I would like to see that happen. I think that's important. I think it's an important part of our outreach. And then I think you've seen the administration has, sent senior officials to the region. Obviously, Secretary Blinken has been there, gave a major speech on democracy in Ecuador, which I thought was quite good. And Jake Sullivan has been there, the National Security Advisor. He's been to Brazil. Many of them have been to Mexico. So, I mean, I think you're seeing it. I think you're seeing the beginning of a strategy. It's also very difficult when you don't have, as my old boss, Secretary Pompeo used to call it, having your team on the field. We still don't have U.S. ambassadors in the majority of countries in the region. I think this is a problem. I think we've got to get people out onto the field. So I would like to see sort of an acceleration of strategy to ensure that we have continued, very good relationships with countries, and that we're able to offer them something tangible. There's a lot of global questions there as well, obviously, with the situation now with Russia and Ukraine and everything that's happening with Iran as well, and Iran, Venezuela, many elements there. But the bottom line for me is that the US has got to show up, it's got to engage, it's got to use all the tools that we have.
Barbara makes the point that Africa in many ways is in a similar boat to Latin America, perhaps not being prioritized as a region as much as other places. How does the system sort of reprioritize some place like that? When something happens that requires maybe a shift in resources or attention.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what tends to happen, and it's really unfortunate, is that you tend to get the attention to shift when there's a crisis, and so the sort of the focus, shifts over when something happens in the region that that causes a crisis sort of situation. Obviously, and I know this from my time in the private sector as well. It's much better. An ounce of prevention is a lot better than having to deal with something, in a moment of crisis. And so, after you get through the crisis, you then reflect on the fact that what did we not do, or what did we do wrong in the run up to that may have contributed to the situation escalating, or may not have. I mean, sometimes the U.S. Didn't have anything to do with the situation escalating. Sometimes we did. But I think it's very hard. And, I think that these regions, I tend to be much more of a north-south. I feel like our foreign policy establishment has long been a very east-west, thinking about Europe and then to Asia. I have been sort of a north-south oriented person. I think that we need to do much more thinking that way. And I think we need to do it in a sustained way, not just when we're between, crises. And it's unfortunate. There's also a certain reality, and I saw it, with my bosses at the State Department, that there's only so many hours in a day, and there's only so many things you can do at once. And so that is also, it's a very real constraint. But what that means is that you need the bureaucracies, you need the day-to-day people who handle Africa or Latin America to be on top of it, to be very good, to be forward-leaning, and to be out there kind of making sure that we don't end up, in crisis situations, in these regions. And so you really need a proactive bureaucracy, I think, recognizing the limits on the time of very, very senior policy people.
We'll be in our webinar here, we'll be talking Africa and specifically Ethiopia in the next month or so. So thanks for that question. If you can comment on this, Kim, what is your opinion on Nicaragua's government and the impact it has or will likely have on Central America and democracy?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, it's something I worked on. It's a tragedy in my view, and what's happened recently with the recent election and the disqualification of the entire opposition from even running in the election. I mean, I think it's brazen. It is not what any of the countries in the region signed up for in the Democratic Charter in the OAS. It runs completely counter to everything as a region that we profess to believe. I think it's really tragic for the Nicaraguan people. And I think it's really a very, very difficult situation. I think the Biden team just has come out recently with new sanctions and is certainly struggling with what to do. But I think it's really concerning. It's really concerning that after all this time, you're able to just disqualify the opposition and take power indefinitely. And I think the demonstration effect is really quite worrisome.
Yeah, and also get the support of elected leaders in the region in doing so. Unfortunately,
it's very, and I think it is getting some attention. I do think people in Washington are focused on it, but it's a very difficult situation. And again, it's one of these where I would really like to see the region step up as well. And as you just pointed out, Michael, it's a bit of a mixed picture there.
Right. Question on intelligence. With the advancement in technology, do you think the digital age limits intelligence operations in many ways? In such environment, do you see the limitations of intelligence operations in authoritarian countries?
Does the digital age, I'm not sure if I understand the question, limit intelligence? I guess a couple of things I would say. First of all, it was clear from my opening comments that, to me, intelligence is a lot more than sort of the secrets part. It's the open part of it, of, reading papers and just understanding what's going on in countries, I would say is actually enhanced. Made a heck of a lot easier when you can have the newspaper app on your phone and read it whenever you want. And you don't have to rely on, some service. Also a heck of a lot easier if you can read it in its native language. So,
Right.
so again, I think the picture for me, intelligence is bigger than just this, the secrets piece. I think it going into sort of the classified, collection pieces of that are harder to talk about. But I would just say, I think it's as is with anything with technology, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. There's tremendous opportunity and tremendous risk. And so I think you end up with those two things hand in hand.
Right. And I mean, there's a lot of, your message, and I think it's a very welcome one for us, is that, despite all the technology, this is really about smart people thinking, smart people reading a lot, and smart people looking at, trying to look at the depth of a situation. I know that if you were looking at Mexico and you saw AMLO and you saw the kind of the historical imagination of somebody like AMLO, this did talk about Lopez Obrador, folks, and we call him AMLO because we love him, but there's the historic imagination there is, that he's somebody who represents the revolutionary nationalist tradition in Mexico, but you also know they always had a relationship with the US. They never could afford not to. And it was something maybe they didn't like to admit, but that was sort of baked into their DNA to some extent, But anyway, lastly, for our chat here is, how do you overcome intelligence gaps in places like Venezuela? And I take it from that question, it's like, okay, these places where we don't really have a great presence anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was one of the things that we had to do during my tenure, which was frankly one of the hardest days of my time, was closing our embassy in Caracas. It was a really, really difficult time, for me and for our, chargé, for our whole team on the ground. People were really committed, and it was very difficult, to leave that embassy. So that's it's a really good question. First of all, I think the answer is partly mind the gap, in the sense of be aware of the fact that there's a lot that you don't know. There's lots of places around the world where there are things that we don't know, either because we don't focus on them or because it's hard to get the information. I think you just got to be mindful of, as I said, knowing what you don't know. I think also, it makes all the more important the day-to-day work of understanding the country and how it operates and its culture and all of that. There's so much information available now on open sources if you're just paying attention. So you shift a bit and you move toward what you can know and what you can learn. And then I always found it useful when I would read a piece of intelligence that explicitly stated what was missing, or the confidence level where our confidence in this is low because we don't feel like we have a good feel for it. That was, to me, always very useful, because it just sort of said, okay, here's what we think based on what we know, but we also know we don't know things, and so here are the possible variables. And I think it's also I'm a little bit of a broken record on this, but it's also an argument for this imagination, for really doing the critical thinking, because then you imagine scenarios and say, you think of things that are plausible and you say, well, if this is plausible, then what would happen? So there's lots of ways to get around it. There's gaps everywhere, even in the places where the US would say we have the best intelligence, on this subject. of anywhere, and there's still gaps. So you've got to be aware of them. You've got to look them in the eye and be willing to to admit where they are.
Part of the challenge we've had with Venezuela. Well, and back in the day, Venezuela problem was there was so much intelligence. There was, because everybody talks about Venezuela, and then when you're not there anymore, when you're not on the ground, you're limited. Same with Cuba. That was another tragedy too, where we were getting maybe a chance of us getting somewhere and starting to figure them out a little bit, and now not being able to do that. And so those are things that we have to end up relying on. I don't mean to be disparaging, but emigres, right? Who oftentimes are as much out of the loop as anybody else after having been living in the country for a while, So that's those are the challenges we face with places like that. I'd like to thank you, Kim, for being with us and giving this great presentation and your time with us on our questions. I hope everybody got a lot out of this today. I certainly did. I hope that you'll be able to come back to speak to us again. And we wish you a lot of luck in what you've been doing lately.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and great to see you, Michael. And I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. And everybody, we'll be having another Inside Intelligence next week, where we will have a speaker on the Ukraine and discussing the tragedy and hope for Ukraine. So catch us next week on January 26th for that. Until then, we'll see you. Thanks for joining us. Bye now.
Bye-bye.